Why does relationship satisfaction drop for both partners after having children?
Dads aren't male mothers. They're supposed to be different. And that difference is incredibly critical to your child.
Why, even when dads are doing more than our fathers ever did, does it still feel like it's not enough?
What is a social construct is this idea that we have in the West that they are provisioners and disciplinarians, essentially. That was completely invented. That's got nothing to do with the biology of fathers.
What do we believe the job of a mum is? What do we believe the job of a dad is?
It's what's your environmental circumstances. In the West, it might be, more nurturing, more hands-on, because you've maybe got those opportunities. But, if you are living on the edge of survival and there is a lion chasing your child, the fact that you can be on the PTA and help them with their homework and structure their social interactions is of absolutely no use.
Can ideas around masculinity actually help me as a father, or are they things I should be fighting against?
We as mothers tend to buffer the risks and the challenges and things like that, and dads don't. Dads are like, you're gonna have to experience it, because one day I'm not gonna be here, and I'm afraid, sorry fellow women, but actually it's right.
Where did these ideas come from? And what happens to our relationships when we try to live up to ideals that were never designed for the lives we're living now? In this podcast, I talk to authors, academics, sociologists, gender experts, and parenting experts to understand what's really happening to couples after they have children and find out if there is a way to be a happier parent. Your book starts with this idea that dads are only 500,000 years old. Like, what? Well, surely we've always needed dads, but what do you mean by that?
What I mean is investing dads are only 500,000 years old. So investing dads are dads who stick around and invest in care and protection and provision and all those sorts of things. So we're mammals, and in our line, it's very rare actually to have an investing dad. Only 5% of mammals have that. Mostly the dads provide the sperm and then leg it, essentially. So what I'm saying is this unusual thing in our line is 500,000 years old. That's when we really needed dads to become investing fathers, this unusual thing in the mammalian line, so that their kids survived, their genes survived, and our species survived.
And you said 5% of mammals, but no primates, is that right? Or no apes?
No apes. So we are the only ape that has this peculiar thing in our line. And that shows how critical it was that humans had it, because it just doesn't evolve unless it's really critical to survival. And it also tells us lots of other things about dads from there. So first of all, it shows us that men must have been primed in some way to do this job well, because evolution doesn't leave things to chance. It will always select for the men who are best at this. And that's how we began to think, well, okay, something biological must happen like it does in women. And it's also the conclusion that we can draw that because evolution doesn't deal in redundancy, so it doesn't cause two roles to evolve, which are absolutely identical if it's not required. Dads must have brought something special to the party, essentially. And so our research was, what is that special thing?
Right. I think at one point in your book, you called evolution like the grey-suited accountant kind of the universe.
It's obsessed, yeah. So basically the whole way our lives are shaped and the whole way our evolution is shaped is to minimize the energy we expend doing things. So it's like, a really sort of time motion study guy who's just like, no, you can't give up to energy. So that's one of the principles of evolutionary science is we go for the most parsimonious explanation, because that's what evolution does. And that's really helped us, again, understand what it is that fathers are bringing to the whole thing.
Okay. So take me back 500,000 years. We are not Homo sapiens yet. We are Homo
Heidelbergensis.
So just leave you to say that one. When I nod, you say Heidelbergensis.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And what do we look like? Have we got tools? What are we doing? Why do we suddenly need dads?
Okay. Yes. No, we're on two legs. We're actually really, really big. We're taller than we are now. We're really robust, really muscular. We're a pretty impressive being, to be honest. We have tools, certainly. Yeah. We are not quite a sort of, sophisticated level tools, but we certainly have stone tools. We hunt. We've started having what we call home bases, which is basically most animals roam through the countryside and don't have a resting place. We have home bases, where we come back to as families and as wider groups, because we've got signs of halves and things from that time. So and we've probably got the rudimentary levels of language as well. So we're moving in the right direction, essentially.
And we've moved to Sussex.
Yeah, we live at Boxgrove in Sussex, where we've actually been since about 700,000 years ago. And it's lovely there. It was tropical then. So there were hippos.
No way. Oh, I can't wait to tell my 12-year-old that. He's going to be so excited. Okay. And then, so previously, the males of the species have been donating their sperm and they're not really been much use afterwards.
Yeah, they're basically like any chimpanzee or gorilla male. They're there to provide the sperm. They probably provide a bit of protection for the wider group. That's what they do. But they really do absolutely no childcare at all. They might play with the kids every now and then if they're bored. But there's no provisioning, there's no protection, there's no nurturing, nothing.
Do we know? And then, right. So what changes? We change to a situation where we know these are our children individually.
Yes.
And then what do these dads do?
So essentially, what happens 500,000 years ago is kind of the end of a really long journey for the human line. And that is, we've become bipedal. We start getting these massive, massive brains. So our brains now are 6 times bigger than they should be for a mammal of our size. And so that kind of starts happening about 1.8 million years ago. And at 1.8 million years ago, our brains become too big to fit through the narrowed birth canal, because we've gone onto 2 legs, without baby and mum dying. So what they've started doing is birthing babies early, and most of the brain growth happens after birth, which is really unusual. And it's very rare, and it only really happens in humans and a couple of other species. And so that happens, and at that point, mums rely on their female friends and family members to help raise their children, because female cooperation or male, basically we say intrasex cooperation occurs first. So that happens, but about 500,000 years ago, the brain takes a massive leap in size again, and suddenly women have to birth their babies even earlier, and we all know how dependent babies are today, and they can't help each other anymore. It's just too much. Alongside this, in that last sort of 1 million years ago, teenagerhood and childhood has evolved. So she's not only got this really dependent baby, she's also got some toddlers, yay, and a load of teenagers stropping around who she's supposed to be looking after. And that becomes really, really difficult to do and keep all those kids alive. So what happens then is the next genetically related person steps in, and that is dad. And he has to do that, because unless he does that, his genes are going to die. So it actually is better for him to remove himself from the wider mating sphere, stop sowing his oats widely, and actually just focus on these kids that he knows are his, and that unless he invests, they aren't going to live, essentially. And that's when that whole change happens. And suddenly, we start seeing sort of pair bonding between men and women for reproductive purposes. And we start to see men investing. And what they did at that point is what they actually kind of still do today, is they took the toddlers and they took the teenagers off the woman's hands, and they were like, right, I'll deal with them. You deal with the baby, essentially, and I will look after them and make sure they're okay. And, that's actually developmentally two of the key points that fathers have a major input, which still exists today.
Wow, that's amazing. Because I think we'll get on, I guess, to a bit more of the kind of provide and protect thing. But there is this narrative, isn't there, that the way we lived in the 70s, say, with the mother as a caring role and the father as a providing role. There's this kind of 'twas ever thus and anything else is unnatural. And what you're saying is the fatherhood role is a nurturing, caring role.
Absolutely, yes. And that's people sometimes say to me, is fatherhood a social construct? No, it's not. It's an evolved role like mums. But what is a social construct is this idea that we have in the West that they are provisioners and disciplinarians, essentially. That was completely invented. That's got nothing to do with the biology of fathers. And actually, the biology of fathers is all primed towards nurturing. That is the primary role of a father, actually, is to nurture, and particularly bring those nurturing skills to those toddlers, to those teenagers. And that it has always been like that.
So let's say I'm a first-time dad and there's no toddlers or teenagers around. Your book really concentrates on on the hormonal and neurological shifts that I'm going through. What's happening to me on that first time round? Is there any point in me until the child reaches toddlerdom?
Absolutely. There's a point in you even before birth. So if you live with the pregnant woman, then even before birth, there's some important bonding stuff going on prenatally. But absolutely, you're important from the minute that child is born, because babies' brains are developing at such a fast rate. And because you have a particularly special role, which we might talk about later, in terms of underpinning resilience and sort of social skills, that needs to start being built from the moment that child is born. So human babies might look like they're doing nothing for those first few months. They're actually just absorbing like a sponge, and you have a key role. But what happens to help you do that is twofold. So first of all, you have hormone changes, the most famous of which is the drop in testosterone. And the drop in testosterone, which is seen in lots of different species that have investing fathers, is really important because testosterone is a hormone of mating. It's really important for men because it helps them become competitive in the mating field, makes them more attractive. So it's really important. But when you become a father, we need you to switch your focus from the mating field to the parenting field.
That would be ideal. Yeah.
It would be, wouldn't it? We don't really need you running off with somebody else at this
mating.
point. Yeah, stop mating immediately, particularly with other people. And so it drops. And it drops by up to a third. And it doesn't return to pre-dad levels unless you lose contact with your child. If you lose contact with your child and you stop the fathering role, it will go back up to prime you again to start all over again. But as long as you have contact, you don't have to co-reside with them. It's not like you have to see them every single day, but you have to have contact. It will remain low because we know that men who have lower testosterone anyway are more motivated to care for children. They're more empathetic. And also, high testosterone blocks the efficacy of two really important bonding hormones, dopamine and oxytocin. So if you drop that testosterone, it's like the potential of those hormones is increased, those bonding hormones. And so you can, build that really important bond with your baby. So that's the really, really key major change. And a lot of men feel it. They feel it. It tends to make you feel much more emotional, maybe a little bit more vulnerable. And so you can feel it in there. I will say the one thing it doesn't do, which I get lots and lots of contact from people who like going to the gym and weightlifting, it doesn't affect the strength of your muscles, so you're okay. But it does prime you to do this caring role, to be motivated to do it. And then there's other hormone changes. We see increases in oxytocin. We see increases in a hormone called prolactin, which is a parenting hormone. We see increases in another hormone called vasopressin, which is all about motivating you. And we interestingly see a decrease in cortisol, which is a bit of a surprise because, as we all know, having a kid is really stressful. But actually, cortisol at high levels constantly, again, isn't very good for you from a health point of view, but it's also not very good for you from a bonding hormone point of view. So it drops as well. So you are literally going through this whole, like women do, a whole change of different hormones going on.
Does women's cortisol drop?
It does, yes. What doesn't drop in terms of cortisol, either for mum or dad, is what we call cortisol reactivity. So your baseline circulating cortisol drops, which is a good thing. But your reactivity, i.e. how quickly you can release a really big spurt of it in a moment of stress, increases. Because obviously that's really important, that if something is going to attack your baby, you respond very quickly. So that increases, but the actual background level of cortisol decreases. So there's hormone changes. There's also brain changes. And these mirror what happens in mum, really. So we see increases in grey and white matter, which means the brain becomes much more functional in those areas, in areas linked to things like nurturing and risk detection and empathy, all of those things which are really important. But also sort of other skills which are good for parenting, such as planning ahead, problem solving, attending, all those sorts of things. We see this real shift around in brain structure. And that's all key towards, again, giving you the best chance you have of being good at this. And the thing to say, particularly for men, and the same for women to a certain extent, is there is a direct relationship between how hands-on you are with your child and the extent of those changes. So the more hands-on you are, the stronger particularly those brain changes will be.
And you quote Ruth Feldman's research with the homosexual couples, the dads, and that's just so fascinating that
it's brilliant,
one of the dads who identifies as the primary carer goes through a level of changes that before that study came out, we previously only thought happened as a result of pregnancy and giving birth.
Yeah. So what it shows is the human brain is very, very open actually to experience. It's not just driven by physiological processes like birth. So what happens in primary caretaking gay fathers is in heterosexual parents, when we see peaks in activation, when they're interacting with their children, the peaks in activation are in different places, which kind of underscores the slightly different roles that mums and dads have. So the peak in activation in women is in the core of the brain. It's a very ancient area of the brain, which is very as old as motherhood. And it's based in the nurturing and risk detection areas. Whereas for dads, that peak in activation is in the what we call the cortical, the area of the outside of the brain, which is much younger from an evolutionary point of view. And it's in areas linked to things like social cognition. And that's because fathers have a role in underpinning social skills development. I will say that's peak. It doesn't mean that dads don't have some activity in nurturing and mums don't have activity in the neocortical, but that's peak. What happens in primary caretaking gay fathers is we see peak activations in both those areas. So they have what we would expect in a father to have in the outside areas of the brain, but we also see what we would more usually see in a mother, which is a peak activation in the nurturing areas of the brain. And what's really even more brilliant, if you're excited by brains, is that there's a new neural connection between the two. So this male can, in a way, balance these two different roles and work with them well and do it efficiently. And that just shows the amazing plasticity of the human brain, that if you actually undertake a particular role, it will actually start moulding your brain to reflect that role.
Wow. Human brains are amazing. That's just incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move back to the heterosexual couple where traditionally, if she survives, because childbirth for human mothers has always been quite dangerous because of the large head, right? Which is obviously one of the reasons those changes can happen, because you would always have a situation where mums can't survive childbirth, but that child needs to survive. So dads are primed to do that. And otherwise there'd be no good Charles Dickens novels. But usually the mum is the primary carer. The father isn't. It's really interesting to hear you say that actually the dad's brain changes. So he actually gets better at this kind of organizing piece as well. But what you do in the book is you show us that actually, because it's not bound by biology, fatherhood is incredibly versatile. And actually, if we look at the way fatherhood looks in different countries and at different times, I suppose, around the world, it's unrecognizable. Whereas motherhood looks relatively similar, right?
Yeah.
Just take us through your examples. You give us 4 examples.
Yeah, so there's different ways of sort of achieving fatherhood. And as you say, it's what we call facultative. It's very, very flexible. So if there's like changes in the environment or changes in circumstances, it's generally dad's role that reacts to those changes rather than mum's role to adapt and to carry on, raising those children. So yeah, I can't remember their names, I'm afraid. But yeah, I have like the classic Bostonian working dad who might work in a high-flying job, maybe isn't at home that much, definitely the primary breadwinner, that kind of thing. And the way he will underpin he will spend time with his children, but it might be that he spends his time with his children, particularly when they're older as teenagers, sort of introducing them to a world which is going to help them further on, like social networking. So he'll take them to the golf club to meet his work colleagues, or he'll make sure they get the good, work experience gig with a friend or whatever it might be. So his primary focus is probably on making sure that they are going to be socially successful going forward, and therefore economically successful. Because in the West, really one of the biggest predictors of how well you're going to do is who you know. And therefore he's going to use his contacts to help the child do that. Then we might have the stay-at-home dad. So he's actually primary caretaking. His partner maybe is off at work. And he's very much focused on what we would probably in the West call more of a mothering role, maybe. He's the one doing the packed lunches. He's the one organising the play dates. He's the one that's on the PTA. He's the one taking the kid to toddler group, all that kind of thing. And he's more focused on, in the West style, it's again about social networks. It's also about nurturing, and it's also about ensuring that kid gets a good education. So he's the one making sure they do the homework, keeping up with what's happening at school, all those sorts of things. And that's a role actually we're seeing increasingly in the UK is happening with men. And then we have sort of maybe cultures we know less about. So we have the Kenyan Kipski tribe, and they are what we call a pastoral tribe. They grow tea, and they live in an area which is quite vulnerable in terms of environment. It's quite a tough existence. So they are kind of less focused on making, go to the golf club and having social niceties and getting the homework done, because really that's not the area that's going to dictate whether or not their kid lives. The area that's going to dictate whether their kid lives is to give them the skills of farming. Give them the skills of farming, and then make sure they have the right social network to be able to go and negotiate good money for that farm, for their produce, and sell it at market. So they will take them into the fields. They will teach them all the skills of farming. They will also then take them to the weekly markets, but they will make sure they understand how it works from an economic point of view, how negotiation works, the social networks you need to build in terms of people you need to provide. And so that's kind of their education then. And then actually we have a group called the Ache, who are actually South American. And I think we have Ache, don't we? It's not Aka, it's Ache.
So I think you've got two, haven't you? The Ache are the warlike tribe.
Yeah, I can't remember my own book. So let's talk about the Ache and the Aka. Let's spread this to 5. Cool. So let's go with the Aka first. The Aka are known as the most hands-on fathers in the world. They live in the Congo. They are a hunter-gatherer tribe who net hunts. And it's the most egalitarian society in the world. So men and women are very much equal. Fathers co-parent with their children. Their children spend up to 50% of their day in physical contact with their father, being hugged, being carried, whatever it might be. It's fathers who co-sleep with their children. And they might even, and this is the one that always gets sort of the headlines in the tabloids, and they might even offer their nipple to suckle the child until the mother is ready to breastfeed. So they I
love telling my kids that. They're like,
yeah, oh no, not a hairy nipple. That's because of the society they're in. They net hunting is like a family endeavor, so they're always together. It's very much it's a subsistence thing. It's not an economic thing, so you don't have a wider market. So they're always with their kids. And there's no sort of primary breadwinner, primary parent situation. So they're very, very egalitarian. And then finally, we have the Ache. And the Ache are at the completely other end of fathering. But that is because they live in a society which is incredibly dangerous in terms of survival. It's quite a warlike tribe situation where they spend the whole time invading each other's tribes. Children are at very high risk of death. Very, very high risk of death. And therefore, their primary focus isn't, all the nice fluffy stuff. It's actually, I've got to keep this kid alive. So they're not very hands-on at all. What they are there for is to defend and protect. And what's really interesting fact about the Ache is they have a thing called partible paternity, which is a child has more than one father. And often it's a group of men who the mother might have had relationships with, and they are all the father of this child, partly because there's no paternity certainty, but it's also because the father is at high risk of dying. And if you leave a child without a father in that environment, the increased risk of it dying is quite staggering. So by having partible paternity, if you die, there are all these other men who will protect your child. So it's really important. So fathering is amazingly diverse. And it's all actually, Robert Devine came down with this really good theory about why, what's actually the driver. And it's what the father perceives to be the biggest risk in that environment. So if the biggest risk in that environment is absolute survival, then he's more likely to be more hands-off because he has to protect that child physically from whatever the threat is. If it's economic, then he's going to be more in a teaching role. He's going to teach that child about how to survive economically. And if it's like our society where, we don't live on the edge of survival economically, comparatively, we are very well off, then we're going to focus on that social and educational risk. Because if you don't get that education, if you don't get those social contacts, that's the biggest risk to your kid's success. And it's just a really interesting way of looking at it. But when you look at different cultures, you see it really works.
And I think what's happening now in our culture, as we've learned more about attachment theory, as we understand more, Corinne Lowe calls it about human capital, like what we need to put into a child to make we've now got this kind of question of, should I be more like the Bostonian, right? And be trying to set up this network for my children, making sure they get to the top private school? Or should I be more like the stay-at-home dad, and my real value that I can bring is in direct care? Which is what it's an amazing time to be a father, but it's quite a confusing one. But I just think it's really great to know that there isn't a right answer to that question. What we're all trying to do is work out the biggest threat and respond accordingly. And fathers can be any of those things. Yeah,
they can. And that's one of the things I say to fathers is, there is no right answer and there's no right way of being. It really, really depends on the context of your environment. I get asked very often, what's a good dad? And I say, well, there isn't a template where this one's good and this one's bad. It's what's your environmental circumstances. Because if in the West, it might be, more nurturing, more hands-on because you've maybe got those opportunities. But, if you are living on the edge of survival and there is a lion chasing your child, the fact that you can, be on the PTA and help them with their homework and structure their social interactions is of absolutely no use. What's of real use is, can you run really, really fast, pick your kid up and climb a tree? If you can do that, then you are a good dad. So it really depends on the environment. I think that's something we've got to get across, is your circumstances really dictate to a large extent not only what you maybe want to do, but what you're able to do. Because as you said, I think fathers in the West in particular are a really tricky stage. It's an exciting stage, but it's tricky because, as you said, we've got all this information now saying fathers have a unique attachment. They bring something special. They're just as evolved to nurture as mums. If they are present in their children's lives, the outcomes are so much better than if they're not. So this is all really good stuff. But then we still live in a world where, unfortunately, work culture hasn't changed. Society hasn't really changed. And we're still telling dads, well, but you still have to be the Bostonian dad and you still have to go to work and earn all the money because, we're in a world where, there's a gender pay gap and men still earn so much more than women, and paternity leave is rubbish and all these sorts of things. So it's actually really tricky for a man to be able to be completely free, actually, to decide what he wants to do, because he might want to nurture, but the economic and political situation where he is might mean that that's a really difficult thing to do.
I'm also thinking he might want to go to the gym and get really, really fit and pretend that that's what's necessary, even though he's not running away from lions. I think I may have been guilty of that. It's like, well, no, I've got to be able to protect my family. Yeah, that's never come up, Alex. Like, not once in 17 years have I been called upon to physically protect them.
Protect your children.
No, it's just not Happened. So probably some of us need to let go of that Jason Bourne fantasy.
Yes.
So let's talk then about as they grow older, because there's this, there's this fascinating piece around. Actually, no, let's not get older quite yet. Let's get into attachment, and I think most people who listen to the podcast are familiar with the basics of attachment theory. But I've always been a little bit cautious around it. My second guest on the show, it's called Nancy Reddy, and she wrote a book called The Good Mother Myth. And she really kind of took the way that Bowlby and Harlow and people asked those questions apart. And it was really fascinating in your book. You talk about this very famous experiment, The Strange Situation, and say that actually the strange situation, which is, well, go on, you explain the strange situation.
Okay, so the strange situation is you have a baby and their carer in the room. Okay, and then a stranger walks into the room, and it's used to assess how a baby is attached to their parent, because obviously you can't do a questionnaire. So you have to watch them. And so what you do, because they're rubbish at questionnaires, they're just
rubbish, yeah.
And so you watch the reaction of this child to the person entering the room. Do they cling to the mother? Do they look curious? Do they cry? What do they do? Then what you do is you the carer leaves the baby in the room with the stranger and leaves. Again, what does the baby do? Does the baby scream? Does the baby crawl towards the stranger? Does the baby completely ignore the stranger? And then the carer comes back. And how does the child react to the carer coming back? Do they ignore them? Do they cling to them like it's absolutely their life? Do they kind of pull the carer over to the stranger to kind of do a little introduction? What do they do? And by looking at what the child does, you can place them in an attachment profile. So are they insecure? Are they secure? Are they disorganized? Are they ambivalent? Whatever. And it's used for a long time. It was used on men and women to find out until it became very, very clear that actually the man's attachment with his child is different, and the strange situation wasn't getting to the particular unique aspects of that. I mean, even John Bowlby didn't think fathers had the babies attached to their fathers in the 1950s.
I mean, I think that's one of the problems with it, wasn't it? That it always matters how we ask the question, and he only ever used mothers in the experiment,
he did.
for which the
Because
obvious conclusion is they just need their mothers. Is that what you didn't try with anyone
you didn't try anyone else. Absolutely. So, you know, actually, babies are little attachment machines. They will literally attach to anyone who meets their needs. So it doesn't have to be mum. It doesn't have to be dad. It can just be, you know, any human who's meeting their needs, they will attach it. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, be brought up by wolves, whatever it might be. But so fathers are assessed in a slightly different way by a thing called the risky situation, which is like the strange situation, but it actually has a set of stairs in it. And it's, I know, don't.
So good. It's so good. I can't believe I didn't know about this.
So you have all the stranger interaction, but you also, how does the child interact with the stairs? And does the child listen to the father if the father says things like, be careful, or encourages the child or whatever? So how does it deal with risk as well? And that just taps into the fact that both mums and dads' attachments are built on nurture. All attachment relationships are based in nurture. But dad has like this additional little bit bolted on, which is called challenge. And dad's attachment, he uses the secure base he's developed by being nurturing to then challenge the child. And he, therefore, is the parent who introduces the child to risk, introduces the child to challenge and failure and all those things that can knock you in life. And that is why fathers are the key parent that underpin resilience.
I love that so much. And I remember my kids saying to me, like, when they were quite a lot younger, being like, you're always making us do scary things, and then it turns out it's really good. And
it's really good.
And that was really lovely. And it's just that's one of the things dads are for. I feel like within that, there's this, well, let's just link that to this other piece, which is the role of dad as, how did you describe it? It's not a social manager, a social...
Well, he's that, what we actually say in terribly technical terms is fathers scaffold their child's entry into the world beyond the family, which basically means fathers underpin all the developmental things that are going to help the child survive and thrive in the big wide world, because the family is quite a benign environment. It can be much more tolerant, it can be much less risky, etc., etc. People sort of buffet you, comfort you from failure. When you go into the real world, oh my god, your social skills have to be good, your resilience skills have to be good, because otherwise you are not going to survive. And it's dad who underpins all those skills that are going to make sure that you can do this. Not saying mums don't at all, they certainly do, but when we look at studies, it's actually the input that dads give, which is much more predictive of how well a child will succeed in the social world than mums are. So they underpin things like development of social language, development of pro-social skills. So that's things like sharing, caring, helping, really important. They underpin what we call executive function. Executive function is things like emotional inhibition, behavioral inhibition, all those things, control your behavior, don't have massive tantrums when you don't get your own way, that kind of thing. And they underpin all of that. And also they are the primary parent, particularly in teenagehood and young adulthood, when it comes to mental health, because they are the ones that give the platform of resilience. If they don't give that input, then the child is much more likely to suffer from mental health issues. So that's what we mean by saying that they underpin all of that social ability, is that they are the primary parent for it.
So I think that this actually causes quite a lot of tension in couples, because I think maybe because we don't understand this, but that there's this idea that mums are basically like, I'm looking after everything. I'm doing all the care. I'm predicting all the discomfort that this child could be through. And basically you're being lazy. And sometimes that is definitely true. But then sometimes I think, particularly in the current zeitgeist of how we parent, and a lot of which is really, really good, this masculine voice that's like, they need to be able to get things wrong. They need to kind of be late for school and get told off. They need to, it's dismissed culturally and within relationships. My problem is that it feels, I mean, do you agree with me? It kind of feels like an easier job than the intense care that mothers are expected to give. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's fair. I think that, yes, I mean, I'm a mum, and I would certainly say that in terms of all that organisation, emotional load, all that kind of thing, I definitely take on much more than my husband. I think that's partly a cultural thing. I think it's partly because we don't believe that fathers are nurturers, that we don't then put it on them. Because it's like mums are instinctive nurturers and dads are. Actually, as we've said, fathers are there to nurture as well. So you should actually be doing all that other stuff as well. And also doing the resilience building bit. I spoke to someone the other day, and I can't remember who they said this, but it's really interesting. When children confront a problem, mums and dads tend to deal with it in a different way. And I am definitely guilty of this, and my husband says I am. Mums will try to change the problem. So they will be the one like saying, oh, no, you've got to go to school, and protecting them, or helping them do their homework in the car so they don't get the detention, or whatever it might be, because they want to protect the child. Whereas dads actually want to change the child and say, okay, you didn't do it. You're now going to have to experience being told off. And that's the difference, is that we as mothers tend to buffer the risks and the challenges and things like that. And dads don't. Dads are like, you're going to have to experience it. Because one day I'm not going to be, and I'm afraid, sorry, fellow women, but actually it's right. Because one day you're not going to be there to buffer them. And the first time they experience failure, it's not a good idea if it's when they're 21 and they have no skills to deal with it. The first time they experience failure, it should be 4 or something like that, because then you really learn your own skills to deal with it. So I do know it causes tension. But I would say,
also, what you're going back to the efficiency piece that we started with, we obviously need both. Otherwise, we wouldn't have both.
You absolutely need both. Otherwise, dad wouldn't be there. So, and this is the thing and this is why I say dads aren't male mothers. They're supposed to be different. And that difference is incredibly critical to your child. And I know a lot of men suffer by trying to live up to what they see as the gold standard of their partner and trying to do all that. And, if they're primary caretaking fathers, trying to do it the way mum does it. No, you need to do it your way, because that child is already getting stuff from mum. You need to do it your way, and it's really important that you do. And I know that causes tension as well, because some mums, and I was definitely like this with my first child before I started studying fathers. I was the mum who would leave the list saying, and at 10:02, you have to change the nappy, and at 10:04, and you're doing it wrong, and all that kind of thing. And that's not helpful, because the child actually has to experience other ways of doing things and other people's personalities. And they need that developmental input. But I know it's a tricky thing to hear. But I will say, I think if we change our mindset to thinking that men are nurturers too, then we can place on them some of that emotional load and go, actually, part of nurturing is making sure the packed lunches are done, making sure the sports kit is clean, all that kind of thing. That is caretaking. But dads then do have this very instinctive, and it is instinctive in men, physicality and pushing of the boundaries and placing in the place of risk and all that kind of thing. It comes naturally to fathers where we just watch them, we see it. And it's not learned behavior.
I think as I've become more vocal with my wife about my concerns about the children and started to do more of the emotional stuff, she's felt relaxed enough to listen to my way of doing things.
Yeah.
Right. I think part of the problem men face is we do worry about our children, and we are nervous about all the things we've talked about and the threats they come at. And we don't share that. So what comes across is you just don't give a shit, and you're going to let him run across the road.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's partly something about knowledge and understanding the difference in roles. It's partly It is partly our culture, which needs to change. And it is partly, I think, yes, once you do step up and you become more of a co-parent, which is actually what dads have evolved to be. They're not a secondary parent, they're a co-parent. Then, as you say, it takes some of the burden off and actually life becomes easier. And it becomes more of a partnership parenting rather than the primary care of the mum parenting and you're kind of their assistant. That dads aren't assistants and they shouldn't be. And they shouldn't, dads, I'm saying this to you shouldn't relax into that role, really.
Yeah. And this was just absolutely groundbreaking for me. Talk about why that tension in the partnership can actually affect fathers more than it affects the mothers. And this is such a good reason to get on top of it when it affects fathers, why that affects children in a way it doesn't with the mothers.
Yeah. So this is known as the fathering vulnerability hypothesis. And when we study families, we study them at sort of 3 separate levels. So we study them at the individual level. So each individual person in that particular network of the family we will study. Then we will study at what we call the dyadic level, which is we will look at the couples within the family. So let's say we've got a triad. So we've got mum and dad and child, mum and child. Okay, so those are the 3 dyads. And then we will study it as a full functioning unit. So the complete triadic level. And what you find when you see conflict between parents in a triadic family is that it doesn't seep, for the mum, it doesn't seep over from the dad-mum dyad to the child-mum dyad. It has absolutely no effect on the way she's interacting with her child, on maybe the tension or stress she's bringing into that relationship, or bringing any of the conflict to that relationship. And that's because mums tend to view families at just one level, which is the dyadic level. That's how they conceive of the family. When you look at men actually look at it at all 3 levels. They look at it as the individuals, they look at it as the dyads, but they also look at it as the fully functioning unit. And if you look at it as the fully functioning unit, it means that if you are arguing with your partner, it spills over into the other relationships in that particular triad. So you are in a conflictual situation with your partner, it will affect the dad-child dyad as well, because it's all interlinked. And this is why when we look at certain predictors, for example, for men's mental health, or for how easily they transition to fatherhood, which is an identity shift, or how well they'll build their attachment with their child, one of the biggest factors in how well those things go is what is the quality of the relationship with the co-parent. And that's what's really interesting. And it's a factor that we don't see, for example, in mum's mental health. And we don't see it in mum's attachment. And we don't see it in mum's transition to motherhood. So it's really critical. And it's one of the reasons why, from my perspective as a fatherhood researcher, I spend a lot of time talking to antenatal teachers and saying, you must spend some time talking about the co-parenting relationship. It happens really rarely in antenatal classes. All that nappy changing, bathing, birthing, breathing, all that kind of stuff. Nobody says, how's your relationship? Let's give you some skills to deal with the relationship, because dads aren't male mothers. They're supposed to be different. And that difference is incredibly critical to your child. It's going to become stressed and you are going to argue because it's really tough. Nobody is given any skills to deal with that. And bearing in mind that actually the co-parenting relationship is the environment in which that baby is going to be born and raised for, it's the environment of development. So if you don't get it right, then it is going to impact your child. We know that, children who grow up with fathers with perinatal depression, it does impact their development if the father is not supported. So it's really, really critical that we understand the different factors that go into the fatherhood experience.
Oh, that feels like a great time to talk about my members community. If you Google school, SKOOL, and be a happier parent, you will find it. And in there, you will find the tools that I wish I'd had. Every framework, every step in there came out of the actual arguments I was having with my partner. The real ones, not the tidy version. And if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you'll start to notice something. We're all having exactly the same arguments. Different words, same fights. So inside the community, there is a group of people working through these problems, asking questions, talking about the blocks they're experiencing. There's the step-by-step framework I built, live calls where you can bring me your actual situation and we'll work through it together, and templates you can pull out and start using straight away to have these difficult conversations that we need to have. It's free to try, then a small membership fee after that. It's cheaper than couples therapy. It's a lot cheaper than divorce or separating. Search Be a Happier Parent on School, SKOOL, and come and join us. There's a link in the show notes. So we have this thing there, that the thing that affects the mother's mental health is solely relationship with the child. And I think you said in the book, temperament of the child can really
temperament of the child. Yeah, things like trauma. So she had a traumatic birth, that can impact. Other things like previous mental health conditions can impact. But it's very much a different set of criteria in terms of what the risks are than it is to the men. The relationship with the co-parent, with the mother, is one of the biggest factors in the risk to perinatal mental health for dads.
And I think also within that, dads looking at the family as a unit in a way that mums don't. One of the reasons that really chimes for me is that when my wife and I were falling out a lot, it made me feel like a bad dad. Whereas it never occurred to her that that meant there was anything going on with her relationship with the child, or even my relationship with the child.
Yes.
She could separate those three things.
Yes.
Whereas for me, the unit was down. The unit was damaged. And that was one of the reasons it felt so painful, because I felt, because I was arguing with my wife, that I was failing my whole family.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very male perspective on it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it's incredible to know. I did a talk, and a lunchtime talk for parents, and we put something out to the parents as to what did they want to discuss, and about 30% of the men came back with relationships, none of the women.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I do think, I'm afraid it is why I come up against a bit of a brick wall when I try to get this introduced into antenatal classes, is because it's not a big factor for women. It's very hard for them to understand why it's important. Why is it important? Why would we waste time talking about that? And that's a real pity, because it is still absolutely fundamental to the child that the relationship between the parents is as healthy as it can be. Yeah,
I mean, also they have to worry about getting a baby out of their vagina.
Yes, they do. They do. And you completely understand.
Really on their mind.
It is really on their mind. I know.
What about our relationship?
Shut up, it hurts. Yeah.
Can we come back to that, maybe? There was another study, just because I love studies, about, because yes, okay, there's this unique role of father, but there's also, obviously this massive influence on the way we were parented. And for this generation of men, lots of us will have had quite authoritarian fathers. Lots of us will have been hit. I was hit, never gratuitously, but let's just agree that it's not cool. And there was this Chinese study that basically showed that fathers who'd had authoritarian parents, I think fathers, were really bad in their response to negative emotions from their child. So their child screaming or having tantrums. And I read that and I was like, gosh, that's awful. But the men who weren't affected by it, despite having authoritarian fathers, had one thing in common, and that was that they were really good at self-regulation.
Yeah. Your ability to regulate your emotions, your ability to deal with those heightened situations is really critical for how you deal with your children. And in a way, it's kind of like, what are your triggers? And it works for mothers as well. It's not just a father thing. If you've been brought up by an authoritarian parent whose way of dealing with shows of emotion, of anger or whatever was simply discipline or, some sort of quite extreme behavior, then you don't learn how to internally emotionally regulate. You don't. And also, one of the key things that we get from our parents is co-regulation. So if you are parenting well, one of the good ways to parent is to co-regulate with your child. So they're having a massive tantrum, let's say. the way you do that is you bring them down with your own calmness, with your own behavior. You co-regulate them. But if you've been brought up by a parent who didn't teach you how to do that, and you never co-regulated with your parent, and the way that extremes of emotion were dealt with was simply by violence, then you have none of those skills, essentially. But the point is that some people actually are less impacted by their environment of upbringing than others. And that's partly genetic. Some people have genes, which means that they are, in a way, armor plated against poor upbringings. And that means those people tend to not have quite as bad a time, essentially, and they have more co-regulatory ability. But it's fascinating. I mean, the whole story of how we're impacted by our parenting, how much of it influences, how much we can break the cycle. I speak to a lot of fathers, and a lot of them, one of the first questions I ask them is, where did you get your ideas about being a dad from? And obviously some of them will say, oh, my dad, he was amazing, da, 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 da. But a pretty high proportion of them will say, well, actually my dad, but not in a good way. I've decided I'm going to do exactly the opposite to what my dad did.
Yeah, because, I've got two mates living that story, and they're beautiful men, beautiful dads.
Exactly.
And,
and they've realised.
I just know what not to do.
Yeah, but that is such power, because actually that self-awareness is the key that will break the cycle. Is being aware and being like, yes, I was parented like that, but I know that was not the right way to be parented, and I know it was wrong, and now I'm going to do something different. Because if you don't have that self-awareness, it will carry on and it will cross generations.
And I think, there's something about that self-regulation where it takes practice, but it can just be yes, I didn't grow up with a lot of it, but my wife actually said, because when we used to argue, we used to just go at it, both of us. She was, I'm going to work on self-regulation. I'm not going to lose it anymore. And I was like, okay, that sounds better. And it's huge. And given all the stuff that we've spoken about in terms of how much bad relationships affect men, that changed my parenting very quickly. When it's just like, no, I'm not going to let myself go there. And I listened to someone really interesting talking about the fact, if your kid's coming at you with that energy and you feel yourself going, maybe you can't co-regulate just yet. And you need to step away, and you need to you need to bring yourself down until you can. Yeah. But we can make those decisions.
Oh, you can. You can absolutely make those decisions. And I think we're increasingly understanding how important co-regulation is to child development. It is very, very important.
Let's just talk about, this is really great, so I don't want to do too much more actually, because I'm like, I don't really want to cut anything. That's been really, it's like we're professionals. It's like, let's just talk about the teaching piece and the fact that you said that basically we're the only animal that teaches. There's some modeling that goes on from other, like a chimp might show its child how to kind of smash something open, but it doesn't give feedback if it does it wrong.
No, it doesn't. No.
So we teach, but there's something that there's something father-like in this role. You actually go with protection and teaching rather than protection and providing. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, we are the only species that teaches. And that's because teaching is cognitively really, really difficult. And therefore you need a massive brain to be able to do it. And also because our world is so complicated, if you try to do everything on a trial and error basis, even just by copying somebody else, you would very quickly come unstuck. So we've been selected for to teach. But no, teaching is really critical. And fathers, I think, are particularly key for it because of this very ancient evolutionary role of taking the toddlers and the teenagers off mum's hands. Because one of the reasons why they had to take the toddlers off the mum's hands was we wean our babies really, really early. And we do that because if we didn't, mums would be breastfeeding for would have to breastfeed for 5 years, not by choice, would have to. And our population wouldn't replace itself. So we've been selected to wean very early.
So mum can get pregnant again.
So she can get
quickly.
pregnant again.
Right.
But that ended up with all these toddlers. So the definition of a toddler is a child who is weaned, but not what we call dietary independent. They're weaned, but they need help finding food, processing food, feeding themselves, all that kind of thing. So one of the big first jobs for dads 500,000 years ago was to take those toddlers, do all that, but then also slowly start to teach them, this is what we eat, This is how we process this. This is how you feed yourself. This is how you find water. This is all these various things. And then carrying on with that through sort of the juvenile childhood period, where there's more learning that needs to be done, right up to teenagehood, when you would have to be given the skills in that environment of skills of hunting, skills of stone tool production, tools of navigation, and then all those social skills, because hunting is a cooperative behavior. So how do I get along with everyone to be able to cooperate to hunt? So there were all these things that these children had to be taught, both socially and technologically. And because mum was, there was no contraception, there was no decision about whether I'm going to have a kid or not. So mum would either be pregnant or breastfeeding permanently. And in that environment, taking your child out and teaching them to hunt or teach was just energetically too risky. It's just, there's no healthcare or anything. It's a very different environment. So she would have to focus entirely on that reproductive role. So it was down to dad to teach everything that had to be done. And so fathers have kind of carried that on today. And, watching fathers, one of the great joys, I know with my own father, watching my husband with my children, is, when dads sort of pass on those skills, or they pass on their interests or whatever it might be, they get really enthusiastic about it. And there is a big teaching role there.
Can I just ask you, how much in hunter-gatherer societies, how much hunting is there? I guess it depends. Not a lot, right? It's mainly foraging.
It's mainly foraging.
Risky?
Hunting is risky. Hunting is also very difficult. Hunting is very competitive because you are dealing with, yes, we are the apex predator, but there's a lot of predators who are very close to being apex predators who are dangerous. And it's a really tough thing to successfully catch something and kill it.
Right.
It is hard. It often involves a very long chase. It's very time consuming. It's very skilled. And so actually, in terms of how much meat is introduced into these from hunting, it's actually really very small, a few percent. Most of it is either scavenging or, foraging.
Did you use the expression power scavenging at one point?
Oh, power scavenging. We don't tend to do that today, but that's probably because we've got guns.
Right.
But before going completely to hunting, what we probably did was power scavenge. So you have scavenging, which is, I've come across this half-eaten carcass, which this lion has. I'll just carry on eating it. Power scavenging is actually fighting the lion for the carcass.
Right. It's a great word.
I know.
That good, sounds quite inefficient.
It is really inefficient and very, very dangerous and rather stupid thing to do, I would have thought. But anyway, there we are.
Just let's finish off with, I'm just going to give you a scenario of a dad now in the UK with, in that tough bit with multiple children under the age of 6, and he's feeling a bit lost because it's not a time to make any moves in his career because he wants to be home for that bath time, but he still feels slightly on the outside of those dyads, and he feels like the kids want mum and he's struggling to find his role. What would you say to him?
I would say, if you can, and if it's something that your partner is comfortable with, spend some time on your own with those kids. It's scary, but you will quickly realise that actually you are competent and you are good at, because part of that feeling of being outside is partly because you don't feel competent at doing this without mum being there. And it's partly because you don't actually think you're that important. You are really, really important, equally important. And so spend some time with the kids on your own. Don't try and be a male mum, because you're not. Do it your way. And you are instinctive at this. You're primed as much as mum is. So this myth that mums are instinctive and dads have to learn stuff, it's just not right. We know as parents, there are instinctive bits, but there is a lot of learning. But so follow your instinct, be yourself. If you can, carve something out that is completely yours. It's something that only you do with your kids. Because not only will therefore that show that you are important in that place, but your kids will start to understand that's what I go to dad for. And it's all those little sort of steps, but a lot of it, I think, comes down to believing a lot of myths about dads. That they're not important, that they're secondary parent, that they're not instinctive, they don't really bring anything special, all that kind of thing. Their kids don't really need them until they're like 8 or 9 or 10. That's just not true. Your kids really need you. It is scary. Raising children is really scary. But if you take little steps and you spend time on your own and you find that special thing that's yours with that kid, I think that really helps. to start to realize you are good at this and you are competent at it.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Anna Machin's book is called The Life of Dad. You can find out more about her work at annamachin.com. Check out my online members community, Be a Happier Parent, on the School platform. That's SKOOL. Step-by-step guides on how to break through the resentment that comes to all of us in the early years of parenting. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you all soon.